Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the CMI, and every Friday at this time, we bring you news and views on management topics that really matter. Now, today, I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest CMI Companion and Deputy Chair of CMI Women, Jo Moffatt. She's a chartered civil engineer, and she is the practice director at Atkins Transportation and also runs their digital asset management practice. She's also a coach and has won many awards for her work in diversity and inclusion. So welcome today, Jo. Great to see you.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks. So let's kick off. You are Deputy Chair of CMI Women, and we know the pandemic has hit women harder in all ways. What would you like to see happen to address this as we build back from COVID?
Yeah, so you're right. Women have been impacted harder in many ways by the pandemic, and I think other minority groups as well actually have been impacted harder. And partly that's, I think, because they sit in generally can work in sectors which have been overly impacted, so whether that's hospitality or food services, for example, but also because they've borne greater responsibility for homeschooling and childcare generally has fallen to women as well. And the World Economic Forum report quite recently was quite interesting. It showed that women represent 39% of the global workforce, but they've accounted for 54% of job losses over the pandemic. Which is quite shocking, really, to have such a bold statistic like that. And the other thing that they highlight in that report is that they think it will take another 100 years to achieve gender equality based on the current rate of progress. So that just shows we really need to accelerate progress around this. And it has been painfully slow. I mean, when you look at the gender pay gap reporting, for example, and particularly the enforcement was suspended this year. And as a result, it's left to companies to voluntarily report, and that voluntary approach has meant that only a quarter of companies have reported this time, compared to last year. And also recent research showed that half of British men say that general concerns around the gender pay gap are not a response to a real problem. So it just shows the sort of scale of the challenge, I think, that still is that we still face. So at CMI Women, we've been having discussions around what needs to happen to address this imbalance, obviously, and how we drive change and build that strong pipeline of women in management and leadership. And so there's a few areas really that I think need to be looked at. One is around government policy. I mean, I mentioned about gender pay gap reporting. It's important that that is continued, expanded, so it requires companies to report on their action plans that come from that gender pay gap reporting, as well as just the reporting, and also extending that to ethnicity as well. So that's the first thing, really. And then expanding regulatory frameworks that support positive action, and particularly delivering flexible working that works for both men and women, and how that can be supported. And also supporting representation at all levels in organisations. And we've seen some progress around this. And, quite recently, there's been the government procurement notice, PPN06, around social value requirements for all government projects, and procurement requiring that to be considered as part of the procurement route. And that social value has included equality. So that just is an avenue that shows the types of things that can create a lot of positive action and change around this. So the second piece is around sort of what organisations can do. And a lot of that, I think, is around focusing on data and benchmarking.
Yes.
And actually setting targets that drive change, so that it really focuses the mind, I think, and also exposes where there isn't change and where maybe things are going backwards as well. And it's only by having that data that can really come into the light, and really shining a light on all HR processes to root out unconscious bias. And support diversity and inclusion. So that's in recruitment, that in progression, and retention. There are a number of issues. Menopause is one that's very sort of taboo, but actually it has quite an impact on people, and it's not something necessarily that organisations address. And also ensuring individuals are supported in their careers as individuals, so they have a really positive lived experience, and they feel empowered to develop and have the support around them to do that. And then the third thing really is around engaging those in the majority, and changing the narrative, so that we have leaders that are presenting a really inclusive vision for the future, and that addresses partly the concerns of the majority that maybe they're losing out because of minority groups taking sort of having more progression, but also it's around connecting that head and heart. It's sort of both around understanding what the clear business case is around it, but also kind of ethically doing the right thing and making that connection, so actually leaders and everyone in the majority in workplaces sees it as their own responsibility, and that they have an ability to make a difference as an individual. And just talking around the sort of different narratives, one of the things that I've been telling everybody to read is Rebel Ideas. It's a shameless plug, I suppose, for Matthew Syer's Rebel Ideas, which I think was the CMI Management Book of the Year last year. And that's been a great way of having a wider engagement and narrative, I think, certainly within my organisation, with those that don't necessarily connect in head or heart around ED&I, and just setting it in a different context. And then understanding the importance of inclusion.
Yeah, I do get that, but here's the thing, and no disrespect to Matthew Syed, he was indeed our Management Book of the Year, and it's a fabulous book. But it seems to me that you're right. We do need to engage men. That's what you're talking about, in particular, as the white men as the majority. And yet, if we have to talk about gender diversity in terms of his, take on it, which is about neurodiversity and diversity of thought, we are still kind of, isn't that sort of, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing. It's like, okay, we can't talk about gender diversity and balance proven to be a business driver. We have to dress it up as neurodiversity. So I mean, what would you say to that, because the facts that you cite, we know gender balance delivers better business results. We know we've gone backwards. We know it drives better outcomes. And we also know it increases opportunities for everybody, including men. So, in light of all of that, shouldn't it stand on its own merits?
Yeah, I absolutely think it should. But after, I suppose, a number of years of banging the drum around it, it despairs me, I suppose, that a number of people still don't have that light bulb moment. And I observe that there's a number in the majority that's slightly kind of hoping that it all goes away. And so actually changing the narrative a little bit and getting people to engage with, the wider diversity, it brings, better innovation, better business results, better functioning in teams, can actually be a way of getting them to then engage with the sort of wider, well, actually, there's a whole sort of gender diversity piece that's a bit more accessible, I suppose. Okay. And certainly it's been something that, pretty much everyone I've recommended it to is then, if they've had issues sort of starting the dialogue around it, it's actually opened up a much more positive engagement with them around it. And actually there's a sort of light bulb, oh, okay, I can engage with this now, I can connect with it now, I can start having the conversations where you then go into more detail. You're absolutely right.
Well, it's so important getting men as allies, and if I can, that's a great bridge to my next question because, and so I guess my view in the end would be whatever works, right? And that's kind of what you're saying. And if that works, that's an interesting take to get people to recognize it. And you're also an accomplished engineer. And progress here for women, if we thought it was bad in the first bit of this discussion, progress here is absolutely dire, as you know, right? We have 12% female engineers in the UK, 13% in the US. I mean, this has been the case for decades, and very high dropout rates for women that do go into engineering. So, you as a practice director are a real rarity in what is an incredibly important profession because of as we build back better, we need more engineers than ever to do things like tackling climate change and building infrastructure and creating healthcare technologies and technologies that advance us and so what do we need to do to solve this problem? That's an even bigger problem.
Yes,
We need more Joes.
So, I mean, you're right, it is a big problem, and 12% of engineers are women. That's not very many. And actually, when I became I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and when I became a fellow, 2% of fellows were women. So it just shows, you're right, the scale of the problem. And retention is a huge challenge. So Engineering UK did a study a couple of years ago that showed that 57% of female engineers who are on the register of professional engineers drop off that register under the age of 45. That compares to 17% of men that drop off the register. So that's really shocking. When I found that statistic, I just took my breath away, really, that you go into sort of that whole, despite the fact the pipeline is, there's low levels of graduates, so 16% of engineering graduates in the UK are women. So that's our pipeline coming in. And then, so they come into the sector, they work in the sector, they go through their sort of, qualification, and then they drop off the register by the time they're 45. It's really, it just shows the sort of the scale of the challenge. So, it's a challenge for all organisations. I work for Atkins, I have done for all of my career. So, it feels like we're making good progress around that. And we were really pleased to be listed in the Times top 50 employers for women that's been published recently. So, but there's a recognition, there's loads to do around this. One of the areas that we've started looking or doing recently is pursuing external accreditation. So it's someone external coming in to help to sort of see how we're doing, to make an assessment of how we're doing, and actually give us sort of specialist support in how we develop what we're doing in our organisation to support women and other minority groups. But going back to that pipeline, STEM engagement is really important in schools to attract girls. And that goes, I suppose, to societal sort of norms of what engineers look like, and it's not someone that looks like me. Generally, if you asked a child to draw a picture of what an engineer looked like, it wouldn't be someone that looked like me, I'm sure. So that's really important. And interestingly, actually, we found that our STEM engagement through COVID actually has reached much more broadly because it's been done virtually than we've been able to do in person. And obviously things, it's a slightly different context in person, but actually the fact that that's broadened out and impacted more people is fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a whole case around reducing barriers for entry for transferable skills. So looking at other sectors and where they have transferable skills and could be upskilled. Encouraging women returners. I mentioned about sort of 54% of women that fall off the professional engineering register. They're still there. They've had, experience that's sort of, made them more valuable employees. So how can we access that pool of people to get them back into engineering and to use those skills? And mentoring and sponsorship obviously is really important, and importance of sponsorship and using your own power to really enable women rather than just the sort of idea of mentoring. So really expanding upon that. And also I reflect recently in Atkins, we've recently launched a two-way mentoring scheme, which has been really valuable as well. And really, so that's a combination of traditional mentoring and reverse mentoring. And actually, all of the groups that have been doing that have found a huge amount of value from that, both the more junior mentor, but also the senior mentor in terms
That's a great idea, because it enables the senior, mostly male leaders to learn from young women how it feels to be a young female engineer, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
really important.
Yeah.
And another thing that I just wanted your view on, and I think it was Hayatan Silim, who, as you will know, is the CEO of the Royal Academy of Engineering. I was talking with her. She's also a companion and very active in this space, as you know. And she was saying that we need to broaden out not only the definition of who an engineer is, as you said, but also what an engineer does, because people, I think, what a lot of women want to work on social problems, and so understanding, for example, the role of engineering in solving climate change and health issues and poverty and feeding the world, it isn't just building a bigger, faster spaceship or a driverless car, right? And understanding the social contributions of engineering, and how important do you think that is to broaden the field?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that engineers are really critical. I mean, I went into engineering because it was around the impact and the benefit that it would bring to society. It's not just about, building stuff for in and of its own self. And as we all have to focus more on sustainability and net zero and the requirements that's going to be a massive undertaking over the next 20 years to be able to achieve those targets, and a lot of that will require sort of people to be, engineers to be driving that change. But also the sort of digital technology and development, and actually what the role of an engineer actually is, will shift away from, when I joined, sort of in the design office, it was sitting with kind of, a piece of paper doing hand calculations and using computers occasionally to help you, and drawing boards where you had kind of pens and rulers, and and things have shifted a huge amount since then. But actually, a lot of design automation is going to increasingly shift the requirement to have people in offices doing that, to actually seeing what the inputs and the outputs are, sense checking the outputs of what the computer's telling us. And actually the role of an engineer will be far more around the kind of stakeholder engagement, and what are all of the sort of the communities and the organizations and the people that are going to be impacted by these projects. How does that feed in at the front end, but also how do we engage with all of those stakeholders through the process? So the kind of the job that the engineers used to do will be far more done by computers. And so actually that whole that opens up a whole new realm of kind of what skills are needed, and the sort of emotional intelligence that's needed around that and things as well. So I think that kind of shift will be really important, and hopefully attract more women into.
Yeah, I think you're right. And obviously a lot of those skills, collaboration, communication, listening, empathy, there is evidence that those are skills that women leaders more naturally gravitate toward. We all have elements of male and female leadership, but there are studies that show that is generally the case. Now, of course, we touched on, you work for Atkins, a large firm, and we have a very successful vaccination program, and looks like we are heading back, at least to a certain degree, to work in an office environment. You're a large people-based company. How are you handling this, and what models are you adopting, and what challenges and opportunities do you see in the return to the office?
Yeah. So I guess firstly, in Atkins, we were pretty flexible before COVID, to be honest. I was working 1 to 2 days a week, been pretty kind of agile, pre-COVID. I guess in the various stages of lockdown, we tried to bring as much flexibility as we could within the rules. We've had a number of key workers, so some core offices have been open throughout. Actually, the current situation is most people are still working at home, but there is flexibility. For all offices are now open from the end of February, and that's open for people to access for a number of reasons. And those reasons include things like well-being, onboarding new starters, activities that are done better in person. And then there's a more formal kind of workplace of the future program, which we're rolling out, which is adopting a bit of a hybrid model. So that's based on people, on average, spending 50% of their working week in the office. And there's a whole campaign really around it's around trusting and empowering individuals to make their own choice. So there's a sort of scale of, first priority is client requirements. For us, the sort of delivering for our clients is utmost. The second is business need, and the third is where the task is best performed. And essentially everyone is empowered to just make their own choice as long as they sort of follow that kind of framework. And then there's a bit of an app that you can book your desk so that you decide, because in the longer term have less office space, but you can make sure when you want to go in and coordinate with your teams and you have space to to actually work. There's a bit of a consultation exercise. I think that's really important to make sure that there aren't, and again, certain minority groups might actually be negatively impacted by change. There will be changes to the office space as well, more collaboration spaces, a bit more sort of digital technology showcase spaces as well. So the office will, start to change in terms of the actual physical workspace, and making sure that certain groups are not impacted by that. And also then the changes of technology, the experience of employees, and also the leadership behaviours that are needed to support that sort of new type of agile working. And obviously we've sort of had it forced upon us by COVID, so everyone sort of got used to got used to those ways of working. So let's not lose what we've gained, but sort of by being forced to do the agility and try and hold on to the good bits.
That actually is absolutely, I agree with all of that. And, what do you think those good bits are? What are the silver linings? You talked about leadership behaviors. What would you like to hold on to?
From COVID? Well, so for me, it's all around paying it forward to others around you, and helping others to succeed. So, there's been so much community spirit, kindness, looking out for each other, the sort of war spirit, if you like, of facing adversity together that's brought people together, sense of empathy, stepping up to make a difference is sort of Captain Tom. And, there's all sorts of that appreciation of others and culture of positivity that I think is really important. And I guess within a leadership perspective, sort of keeping that inherent flexibility and trust in people to do the right thing. It's got to be held on to. That's a real kind of silver lining, and let's not lose that inadvertently as we go back to
I couldn't agree more. Very well said. And I know I want to have time for questions, but I wanted to ask you as a leader, what's the biggest lesson you've learned in this pandemic about your own leadership style, and what would be your advice for other for those on this broadcast that may be struggling?
So I guess the one of my biggest learnings is around, I suppose, the importance of remaining visible, but also the power of listening and really listening to understand. And I've appreciated my coaching training, which is a lot around listening. I think that's been really important, just to give the space to listen to what people are feeling, listen to people when they're sharing their experiences, and providing the environment that gives that psychological safety that allows people to sort of be completely open about what they're experiencing, what's going to be helpful for them, what others can do around them to support them. There's another really important piece, I think, around paying it forward as well, that is just sort of, again, been really humbled by how much I've seen of that. It's something that's really important for me around sort of mentoring and supporting others, and I think that's sort of encouraging others to do that, and the kind of ripple effect that it can have sort of across our organizations and our sort of nation as a whole, I think is really powerful. And in terms of advice, I guess there's a big being clear about the strengths that you bring, because even if you doesn't feel like it, you will be bringing stuff that adds value, that's aligned to those strengths. So really kind of tapping into that, looking for support from people around you and asking for help. I think it's really important. So those are my sort of,
well, that's great. Yeah, I think leading from strength and not being afraid to ask for help, those are great tips. Now we've got some questions. The first is from Jasmine. Hi, Jo. Is the diversity problem in engineering based around discrimination in recruitment or a broken pipeline of new talent?
Oh, okay. So diversity problem, discrimination in recruitment. I would like to think that there isn't discrimination in recruitment now. Obviously, it depends on the organisation, but there's a lot of work that we do at Atkins around making sure that the recruitment process doesn't have discrimination in it. The fact that we maybe don't have the numbers coming through in the pipeline, we've said before about the numbers of sort of graduates coming in and so forth. I think that feels like it's more of the issue. But then there's also the retention piece that's not really addressed in the question, I think, which is not just about where people come into the pipeline. It's around those that are currently within work, and retaining those and making sure that they sort of feel that they can perform to their utmost.
Yeah, and you said going back to the 57% that have dropped off the register, find out who they are and get them back in, right? I think that's a great idea, actually. Now, here is a very good question from Alan. Hi, are there any countries leading the way in terms of gender diversity in engineering, and what can we learn from others or indeed other professions?
Oh, now that's a good question. So I guess the countries that are doing very well, the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, I guess there's a lot more government policy, I suppose, that supports diversity. I don't know in terms of the actual sort of engineering aspect of what the performance is within those countries. I think we can learn from others in other professions. I think other professions, some are maybe probably a little bit more open. The barriers to entering profession in engineering at the moment is you have to have to become a chartered engineer, you have to have a master's degree in engineering, for example. And so there's a piece around looking at the sort of barriers and how that could be done in a more sort of flexible way. I think there's a whole piece around learning from others, actually, and learning from other organisations that I'm really keen on, doing joint events and sort of sharing. And that's what's great about CMI and CMI Women, actually, is I sort of widen the discussion and my exposure to what's happening in other professions and other organisations by widening my network and having those discussions wider. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was just looking at these from Alan's question, some of the countries where there are a high percentage of female engineers, and there are some surprising ones. So like Malaysia and Russia and some of the countries in ASEAN, and there's interesting, one theory is that there's a huge emphasis in school on science and technology and math, and that so engineering is then considered a much more well-trodden route, and there's less choice in what you can take. So it's a great question, Alan, but you're right, we can learn from others always. So question from Kay. Do you think male mentors can support women in their careers and understand the nuances of this to the same extent as female mentors? Is there a benefit in having a woman who has encountered similar?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting one, because I suppose women often gravitate towards other women to get mentoring. What I would say, and what I kind of advise people really, is that actually you can have a number of mentors, and you might look to certain mentors for mentoring around certain things. You don't necessarily look to one person to give you the whole package. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, actually, if you've got a good mentoring relationship, then actually a male mentor might give you a slightly different perspective than a female mentor that might be sort of beneficial. And actually, most men who are mentoring, most men have knowledge of the challenges that women have faced in the workplace through whatever relationships that they have, or their children, or their sort of colleagues, or whatever. So actually, sort of having a a mentoring sort of relationship, which is, a woman getting mentoring from a man can be really beneficial, not if for nothing else than actually it's giving a kind of wider perspectives and actually helping those in majority positions understand the challenges which are being faced. As long as there's the strength of relationship to allow that honesty, I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, and you mentioned your reverse mentoring program and how beneficial that was to both sides. And I love your thought about having more than one mentor, and agree with it. I think there's having your own personal supply of mentors that you go to for different parts of advice and broaden this perspective and get that diversity of thought is a great thing. Okay, we've got one last question here from Annalisa. Oh, it's a great one. Jo, what would you advise your younger self if you could go back in time?
So I think it's to trust my gut instinct and to not feel kind of battered down in many ways. Not understanding the power in being a bit different. As a sort of woman in engineering, that difference actually is powerful. So I guess if I had understood that a bit earlier, I think that would have been really valuable. And the second piece goes to the point I said before, is around asking for help when you need it, and not feeling like I had to just bear it all on my own. And that was something I learned later on, and I'm really glad I did, but I would have liked to have learned that earlier. So.
Great. Well, it's never too late to ask for help. And it's never too late, if you've enjoyed today, to join CMI. So you'll find more instructions in the chat on how to do that. And thank you, Jo, so much for your insights and sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful Friday, and I'll see you next week. Take care.